Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion Remastered tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to be discussing the star signs. While the birth sign that your character is born under isn't the single most impactful decision that you'll make at character creation, it is the decision with the largest difference between the good choices and the bad choices. The strong birth signs are vastly stronger than the weak birth signs, and especially in the early game where they are a significant proportion of the total power of your character, choosing the right one can be massively impactful on how easy or how difficult a time you have. In addition, there's a number of unique playstyles and strategies that are simply not possible without choosing the correct birth sign to enable them, and these birth signs still give you enormous benefits on into the late game, especially if you're playing a spellcaster, so choosing the right one can significantly impact your build. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Brian Burmeister for the $10 donation, Ethan McLaughlin for the $7, and It's Max AMX and Emerelm for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. It really means a lot. Alright, let's talk star signs. Also, a quick word on how we're going to be rating these birth signs. So firstly, this guide is aimed primarily at master difficulty, though of course the information will be useful on lower difficulties as well. And my assumption is that you want your character to win fights and die as little as possible, so we're looking for a birth sign that makes us as powerful as we can. I've divided the 13 possible birth signs into 5 different tiers. In S tier, signs that are always awesome choices. These abilities are very powerful, they're strong throughout the entire game, they give you an enormous boost to the overall power level of your character. When in doubt, you can always choose an S tier birth sign and your character will always gain a massive benefit as a result. In A tier, options that are extremely powerful, but maybe you have to manage a drawback or the bonuses that they give you can get elsewhere, but these are still always excellent choices, especially if you want the strategies that these birth signs enable. In B tier, options that are solid choices, usually these will give you a really nice benefit in the early game, but fall off a little towards the end game, or the benefits that they give you are significant, but less so than the signs in higher tiers. In C tier, ones with situational benefits, typically you are going to be better off choosing something in a higher tier, but these will still give you a pretty solid boost to your character, and no character with a C tier birth sign will be upset because you'll still get a nice bonus. And then in D tier, ones that mostly don't do anything. I haven't included an F tier because none of them actively make your character weaker other than through opportunity cost, but the D tier birth signs may as well not exist, so you're more or less sacrificing the power of this character creation option if you choose one of these. We're going to start with a nice straightforward one, the Warrior. By the way, we're just doing these in the order they show up in the character creation screen, so if you're wondering why we're starting with W, that's why. To make things a little easier as we're talking about these star signs, I'm going to bring up the entry on the unofficial Elder Scrolls Pages wiki for this star sign so that we can have what it does in front of us while we're talking about it, making sure that we're always on the same page in terms of the actual effect of the star signs. The Warrior gives us 10 endurance and 10 strength, making it pretty nice if you are trying to build a warrior. That's why it's the first attribute in the character creation screen, because it's one of the most basic ones. This, at first glance, looks like a pretty good deal. Endurance I rated as S tier in my attributes tier list because hit points are really important, and strength I rated as A tier. Together, 10 points of endurance and strength give you 19 total bonus hit points. It's 13 1/3 for the endurance and then 6 2/3 for the strength, but they both round down, so you end up with 19 total hit points. And then because you get additional hit points per level from endurance, you get an extra 1 hit point per level if you take the Warrior as your birth sign. Overall, this represents a not insignificant boost to your character's survivability in the early game, and strength of course increases your damage if you're using strength-based weapons, so at first glance, the Warrior looks like a pretty good deal. However, there's a couple things holding this birth sign back from being as good as it looks like when you first examine it. Firstly, this is not actually that significant a total bonus. 10 endurance and 10 strength represents 20 points of attributes, or 20 virtue points, which is what you use to increase your attributes when you level up. You get 12 of those per level, so 20 virtue points is just under 2 levels worth of attribute points, which is one of the lower amounts of total stats that you can get from your star sign in general. While these are very strong attributes to increase, they also have less effect in the early game. Strength increases your damage, but the damage increase is based on a multiplier of your the base damage of your weapons modified by your skills. So until you have higher level gear and higher level skills, increasing your strength doesn't actually increase your damage to the amount that it will actually round up to increase your damage per attack. So you're mostly just getting the additional encumbrance in the early game, which is when the warrior is, of course, at its most impactful because you haven't raised your other attributes relative to this yet. There's a few other factors to consider as well. Firstly, this Fortify Endurance and Fortify Strength benefit from this birth sign do not allow you to increase your attributes over 100. They act as a head start rather than a total increase to your endgame totals. So if you're a character that wants to take the warrior, you're probably prioritizing raising endurance and raising strength pretty highly with your virtue points when you level up. So you'll get these to 100 quite quickly anyways, at which point the bonuses from the warrior are wasted, or at least are being spent on less important attributes for your build. In addition to that, while this was a really, really good pick in the original Oblivion, because having earlier endurance was really important. In original Oblivion, your HP when you leveled up was based on your endurance at the time when you gained that level, so character builds required you to build your endurance as quickly as possible to max out your endgame HP. In the remaster, the extra HP you get from endurance has been made retroactive. So while endurance is still a really important stat that it's really nice to have boosts to early, it's less critical to have an increase to it in the early game. Finally, the warrior is in direct competition with another star sign that I think is mostly just stronger for the characters that would want it in the form of the lady. The lady gives you 10 endurance and 10 willpower, and willpower is generally a more important attribute than strength, even for strength-based characters, because having additional fatigue pool, especially early game, allows you to maintain blocking, dodging, running, and power attacking much more easily, so very, very important, even if you aren't planning to use the the magic regeneration that willpower gives you. But the magic regeneration is also incredibly important, even for characters that are primarily weapon users, because it allows you to cast things like Restore Health, Fortify Attribute spells, Restore Fatigue, Shield spells, and so on much more frequently, which every character on high difficulties, unless you're doing a specific challenge run where you don't cast spells, is going to want to take advantage of. So not only are the benefits of the warrior sort of minor, and they get worse as the game goes on, and then eventually go away entirely, it's also in direct competition with another star sign that I think mostly does the same thing, but better. Put that all together, and I am sounding kind of harsh on the warrior, but I think that in general, most characters that are considering the warrior are better off taking the lady. So I'm going to put it in C tier. Obviously, a 2-level head start on 2 really strong attributes is still a really nice bonus. You're definitely not going to be sad to play the warrior, and if you've already picked it at character creation, don't worry, you didn't ruin your character or anything. But for most characters, there's just going to be stronger options because these bonuses are minor, go away quickly, and there's a better way to get them with a different star sign that just gives you a similar bonus, but overall a stronger option. Next up, the Mage. The Mage is also a very straightforward star sign with just a nice passive benefit, in this case 50 points of maximum magicka. The 50 points of maximum magicka is the equivalent of 25 points of intelligence, because each point of intelligence is worth 2 points of max magicka. In the remaster, your maximum magicka no longer increases your regeneration rate, because it's no longer based on a percentage of your max, it's based on your willpower instead, but maximum magicka is still a really important statistic in order to cast higher level and more powerful spells. This is already the equivalent of 25 points of attributes, as opposed to the warrior's 20 points of attributes, and if you wanted to get 50 points of magicka just from leveling intelligence, because you can only increase an attribute by a maximum 5 points per level, it would take you at least 5 levels of putting points into intelligence in order to achieve this Fortify Magicka effect. So in terms of raw stats, the Mage is already ahead of the warrior, but it's actually quite a bit better than that. Because this is a Fortify Magicka effect, rather than an increase to your intelligence, it just increases your maximum magic directly, This will allow you to effectively get to 125 points of intelligence. The mage will still have its power even in the end game, whereas a boost to your intelligence from a star sign would not. So unlike the warrior, the mage is not just a head start on increasing your power level, but also an increase to your total power in the end game. Having this extra magicka means that you can skip leveling intelligence for many more levels, while still being able to cast the highest level and most powerful spells available to you, allowing you to prioritize more important attributes much more heavily, things like endurance and willpower, which can make your spellcasting even better. The mage is really, really good, of course, if you plan to be a spellcaster, and also really nice if you don't plan to be a spellcaster, but just want to support your character with higher level spells, because it's really good early game, allowing you to put those points into another stat while still casting high level spells, and really good end game because it increases the total maximum power of the spells that you can cast, even before you start doing Fortify Magicka loops and stuff like that in order to just increase your total values. That makes the mage just an amazing default pick. It's a great early game, it's a great end game, it has no downsides, and the bonus to maximum magicka is really powerful, increasing the total power of your spells and abilities and giving your character a nice jump start in the early game. So the mage is always going to be a great pick no matter what build you're going for, but especially if you are in fact playing a mage, then the mage is excellent, comes with no downsides, unlike the other ways to increase your magicka with your star sign, so it's going straight into S tier. When in doubt, this is always an incredible pick and will always make your character much stronger. The Thief. The Thief is another star sign that simply increases your attributes, and is the last of the three sort of basic star signs with no downsides that the game kind of pushes you towards taking if you don't have anything more specific in mind when creating your character. The Thief gives you 10 points of agility, 10 points of luck, and 10 points of speed. So right away, you can see that this is worth 30 total attribute points, compared to the warrior's 20 total attribute points, or the mage's equivalent of 25 total attribute points. But it's actually even more than that, because the Thief gives you a bonus to your luck. Now, the speed and agility bonus are pretty nice. If this was all that it gave you without the luck bonus, then the Thief would still be a totally okay star sign. But luck is a unique attribute. In Oblivion Remastered, luck costs you 4 virtue points to level up, and can only be leveled a maximum of once per level that you gain. So to gain these 10 points of luck, we would have to spend 40 total virtue points. Where the warrior gave us 20, the thief gives us 60 total virtue points as a head start on leveling up, and in order to get our luck, an additional 10 points of luck, we would have needed to spend 4 points on it each level for 10 levels, so we'd need to be a minimum of level 11 before we could reach this amount of luck naturally. That's a pretty solid ways into the early game. So if the luck is worth having, then it affects the head start here affects your gameplay for a lot longer than it does on the other star signs that just increase your attributes. The Thief is also the most optimal way to reach 100 in every attribute, because luck is harder to level if you want the most powerful possible endgame character that gets 100 in every attribute. Then starting with the Thief star sign so that you have 10 fewer levels you have to spend leveling luck is very, very important to make that happen. 60 virtues is a lot. That's 5 levels worth of stats that you are up compared to another character just at the start of the game. And 10 points of luck is a +4 bonus to all of your skills, which is a pretty solid increase to the effectiveness of your skills in the early game. If you have, say, 40 starting stats in one of your combat skills, that's a 10% increase to the effectiveness of your combat skills. And on the skills that you didn't select as major skills, you can have this be as much as almost doubling the effectiveness of those skills. Going from 5 security to 9 security will make the lockpicking minigame a lot easier. So having these extra 4 points can be a pretty significant boost, especially to skills that you didn't prioritize at character creation if you have the extra luck from the Thief. Agility and speed are also really nice attributes to have. I rated speed as S tier because being able to dodge enemy attacks, really important in the early game, and agility, of course, very important if you're a character that's attacking with daggers, short swords, or bows. And also, compared to strength, has a larger impact on your damage, because you will be able to use your dodges, blocks, and power attacks more often, thanks to being able to regenerate your fatigue with the regeneration that agility gives you. And also, bows have had their damage increased across the board, so they have a much higher base damage output than other weapons. They attack slower, but the base damage is higher, so the multiplier that you get from agility is more impactful than the multiplier from strength if you're an archery character. Put this all together, and the Thief is just a really solid pick. Yes, in the extreme endgame, these abilities will stop being that impactful, but this makes your early game vastly smoother, and 5 whole levels worth of extra attribute points is a really big boost to your early game effectiveness. The early game is often the hardest part of the game because you don't have the tools to boost your stats or overcome what enemies are trying to do. So the Thief is just a really solid pick, and a great default pick for pretty much any character. Overall, what we're going to do with the Thief is put it in A tier. I think it doesn't quite reach the heights of the Mage or the other S tier bonuses because it is primarily an early game bonus and you won't get that much benefit from it as you progress through the game. And while the luck bonuses are really nice to have, they do quickly get outscaled just by leveling your skills. But in the early game, the Thief is really, really good. And if you don't have any other ideas for which star sign to take for your character, I always recommend just grabbing the Thief. It's a great just default pick if you don't have something else in mind. Next up, another simple boost to your stats, the Steed. The Steed gives you 20 points of speed, so it's easy to remember. Want speed? Go Steed. The 20 points of additional speed are a pretty significant boost to your movement speed, and I rated that as an S tier attribute because the higher your speed, especially against the faster enemies in the remake and the faster projectiles in the remake, the easier it is to avoid taking damage so that you can regenerate your stats, dodge enemy projectiles, stay out of range of their attacks, and so on, as well as just traversing the map faster, which is really nice. However, this has the same problem as the others that just boost your attributes, which is that it doesn't increase your endgame stats, so if you want really high speed, then you could just invest attribute points. And also it's in direct competition with the Thief, which gives you 10 points of speed, as well as the agility and luck. The extra stamina regen from agility will often convert into higher movement speed anyways, because you can sprint for longer, dodge for longer, and so on, so it makes it easier to dodge attacks anyways. And also the effectively 4 points of athletics and acrobatics that you get from the luck bonus from the Thief mean that the difference in movement speed between the Steed and the Thief is really not that high. You will be faster with the Steed, but not by as much as you might think. So in general, most characters that would want the Steed are better off just taking the Thief. For that reason, I'm going to, just like the Warrior, place it in C tier. It's certainly not a bad choice because it's a great set of stats that's useful in the early game, but there's another option that, for the most part, is going to do the same thing, but almost straight up better. Next up, our first star sign with a downside, the Apprentice. The Apprentice, just like the Mage, increases your magicka, but it does so by 100 points for your maximum magicka, rather than the 50 points that the Mage gives you. In exchange for this larger bonus, you get a correspondingly brutal downside, 100% weakness to magic. This doubles the effect that all negative magic has on you, so you will receive double damage from all damaging spells, and double the duration of negative effects like paralysis and so on. This can be mitigated somewhat by increasing your resistance to magic, but it makes it much, much harder to reach high resistance levels if you're playing the Apprentice. So you are going to be, until you get really late game equipment and enchanting and spells, in mortal peril from just taking even a low-level spell attack from an enemy and dying instantly. The Apprentice also doesn't give you a bonus to your hit points or anything, so in the early game, on high difficulty settings, any spell attack that you take, if you're playing the Apprentice, will pretty much be instantly lethal, so you're always going to have to dodge. Now, 100 points of magicka is a huge bonus. Obviously, I put the Mage in S tier because 50 points of magicka was a great bonus, so 100 points of magicka is an even better bonus. But the weakness on the Apprentice is very dangerous. If you're trying not to die, then 100% weakness to magic is going to make that much, much more difficult, or force you to play in very different ways in order to mitigate it. Have increases to your dodge, finding spell absorption and spell resistance effects, and so on can help you mitigate the downside here. You can hide behind your summons if you're playing a conjuration build to avoid taking hits, but some enemies have AoE spells, so even that isn't necessarily going to help you when things are starting to go wrong. So the Apprentice is a very high risk, but very high reward birth sign. I'm going to put it in A tier because the bonuses are huge. The amount of additional magicka that you get from the Apprentice is huge, but the downside is very difficult to manage. I find this playstyle quite fun, personally, where you have to dodge every attack or you die. But it is harder to play, I think, overall than the Mage. So generally speaking, if you're less experienced with the game, I would definitely recommend taking the Mage over the Apprentice. The Apprentice will lead to a lot of frustration where you just get hit by a stray spell and die instantly. This obviously is a very powerful tool, but a very dangerous one. Next up, the first birth sign that's not a passive benefit to your stats, but instead gives you an activated ability, the Shadow. The Shadow gives you the ability to, once per day, cast the Moon Shadow Greater Power, which turns you invisible for 60 seconds. Once per day here is actually once per day, so you can wait in order to refresh it. You don't have to actually sleep, which is kind of important because sleeping in Oblivion comes with the downside of leveling up, and if you're trying to manage the enemy levels, you may want to delay leveling up, depending on exactly how you're progressing through the game. Invisibility is a very good spell. It prevents enemies from seeing you or interacting with you, though as soon as you attack or interact with an object, the invisibility will be dispelled. It's not like Chameleon, which allows you to do stuff while invisible, but it's still extremely useful. You can use it to gain you can use it, of course, for stealth, to steal stuff and so on, or to sneak up on an enemy to sneak attack them. But you can also use it to de-aggro enemies in order to regenerate your magicka, in order to regenerate your health and fatigue, or just to stay away, to get away from enemies if you have taken on a fight that it turns out you can't win. However, invisibility is such a good spell, you really want to be able to cast it more than once per day, and it's a pretty cheap spell to learn, so if you want invisibility, you can just get it from a spell. You don't have to spend your entire birth sign on the ability to do this once per day, which of course is a real limitation. And the impact of being able to cast this for a 1 minute invisibility is just not that high. You give up a lot of opportunity cost to take the Shadow and get very little in return. Once per day invisibility, just not exciting. And this birth sign is going into D tier because it just really doesn't do very much. And the things that it does do, you can just cast with a spell anyways. Next up, one of the more interesting birth signs in the game, the Ritual. The Ritual gives you not one, but two different powers. One greater and one lesser. The greater one can only be used once per day, and the lesser can be used anytime, but just costs your magicka in order to cast. I'll talk about the greater power first. So firstly we get Mara's Gift, which gives us a restore health 200 points once per day. This is certainly not something that we'd be that excited about taking a birth sign for on its own, but it's definitely nice to have. A full heal can definitely keep you alive, so it's a great panic button if you find yourself in trouble, especially in the early game where you won't necessarily have the restore health potions or restore health spells that can do this effect for you. So Mara's Gift, while not that impactful, is definitely something that's nice to have from the Ritual. You also get the Blessed Word, lesser power, which allows you to cast Turn Undead on enemies for a 100 point value, or a maximum level Turn Undead up to level 25 undead enemies. Turn Undead makes them run away and stops them from fighting, so it's very useful at winning fights against undead enemies. However, there's a couple subtleties about the Ritual version of this spell that actually make it much more interesting than Turn Undead as a normal version of the spell. Turn Undead is an effect that relies on enemy level. So 100 points of Turn Undead, the highest level undead enemies in the game are level 25, so it should turn every undead in the game. However, it's affected by spell effectiveness, which is a stat that's based on your armor. So if you have less than 100% spell effectiveness, i.e. you're wearing any armor, then a max level Turn Undead spell, a 100 point Turn Undead spell, will not turn max level enemies because it will be reduced by your spell effectiveness, reducing the total level that you can affect. And so enemies at level 25 will not be turned. The Ritual's version of this Turn Undead spell, because it's a power and not a spell, is not affected by spell effectiveness. So it will always work on every undead in the game. That means that for the cost of 40 magicka with the Ritual Birth Sign, you get to just freely automatically win any fight against any undead in the game, which is very, very valuable. Obviously, not every enemy in the game is undead, but there's a lot of undead in the game, and some of them are pretty dangerous in the late game, so the Ritual Burst Sign just wins you a reasonable percentage of dangerous fights, more or less for free. It mostly doesn't do anything outside of fights against undead, but because it works all the time, even when a normal turn undead spell wouldn't work, and because you get it from the beginning of the game, these are pretty dangerous enemies, the advantage that it gives you is actually not as small as you might think, given that the other birth signs that give you powers are not particularly good. It also, of course, lets you craft custom spells with these effects, but given that Restore Health is the easiest spell effect in the game to get, and you already have the best Turn Undead spell in the game when you're playing the Ritual, you probably won't be crafting custom spells using these effects from the Ritual that often. Overall, the Ritual is a situational, but very powerful birth sign. The panic button from the 200 points of healing is very, very useful in the early game and remains moderately useful on throughout the later game. It can keep you alive in circumstances where you would otherwise die, and combine that with auto-winning a certain number of fights in the game against reasonably tough enemies, and there's a lot of undead enemies throughout Oblivion, so auto-winning those does make your overall adventuring career much easier. That being said, it doesn't really do anything outside of fights against undead, so it's not going to help you in a lot of the most difficult fights in the game, but it's still a pretty useful ability. I'm going to give it B tier because when it comes up, it's very good. It won't come up all the time, but the Ritual is definitely worth considering if you just hate fighting undead and want to auto-win your fights against them. Next up, we have probably the weirdest and most controversial birth sign, the Atronach. The Atronach gives you 150 bonus points of magicka. That's 50% more than the Apprentice, or 3 times the amount that the Mage gives you, for an equivalent of 75 points of intelligence in terms of increases to your maximum magicka. It also gives you 50% spell absorption. Spell absorption is a chance, so in this case a 50% chance, when affected by a hostile spell, to completely negate the effects of the spell and instead convert it to magicka in your maximum magicka pool. In exchange for these obviously incredible bonuses, you completely lose the ability to naturally regenerate magicka. So instead of having it restore over time, you have to find other ways to restore it, either by absorbing spellcasts made against you, or through restoring it with alchemy, restoring it with various other tools that can give you restore magicka recovery. Now, I mentioned that this is the most controversial birth sign in Oblivion, because when you play an Atronach character, pretty much the entire game becomes about managing the downsides and upsides of this birth sign. Without natural magicka regeneration, you need to find other ways to regenerate it, and so there are a few different ways that you can do that. You can spend a lot of time collecting ingredients in order to make magicka regeneration potions. You can find ways to absorb spells. Getting to 100% spell absorption will allow you to just tank enemy mages forever, constantly increasing your magicka, though of course you have to go find them and seek them out. You can also do this by summoning creatures that can cast spells and then attacking them until they become hostile. Then they'll shoot spell effects at you, which you will then absorb, increasing your magicka. There's also an exploit where, for whatever reason, most effects that you cast on yourself do not just go straight through spell absorption, but telekinesis uniquely does not. So if you have a spell that has telekinesis as a component, it will be absorbed and regenerate your magicka. Since the amount that you regenerate with spell absorption is equal to the base magicka cost of that spell, and the magicka cost for actually casting a spell is modified by your skills down to only 20% of the base cost at 100 in the spell. With 100 mysticism, casting a spell of telekinesis means that you spend 20% of the base cost of that spell and get back 100%. even if it only happens half the time with 50% spell absorption, you're still making a profit. So even without increasing your spell absorption otherwise, you can use this exploit to constantly regenerate magicka. However, if you don't want to abuse that exploit, it was left in the remaster, so, you know, maybe it's an intended mechanic. It sort of seems like it's not, but up to you, obviously. It's a single-player game, so who cares? But if you don't want to use that, then you're going to be stuck playing Oblivion as kind of a resource management survival game where you have to scrounge for flax seeds and other ingredients to make potions to increase your magicka regeneration, or hunt down enemies in order to regenerate your magicka. Now, there's another way to use the Atronach. If you're playing a character that's not casting spells at all, 50% spell absorption is just awesome, and you don't care about losing the magicka, because then you just are going to have 50% spell absorption on pretty much every spell cast, and not being able to regenerate doesn't matter if you're not casting spells. This is weaker than playing a normal martial character that casts spells. Spells in Oblivion are so good, and on high difficulty settings, they're basically mandatory. You can play challenge runs where you don't cast spells, but it's very difficult and often requires other abuses of, or exploits or abuses of mechanics. So that's a fairly unusual way to build a character, but it is something that you can do. But for the most part, with the Atronach, you're trying to boost your magicka as much as possible, and then either chug potions or use one of the sort of exploits of conjuring enemies and attacking them, or casting telekinesis on yourself in order to regenerate your magicka. I will say that personally, I find Atronach builds extremely tedious to play. Not having natural regeneration just slows down the game considerably. And so unless you are really interested in the management and resource management aspect of this star sign, and are an experienced player who can manage the downsides or understands how to use the crafting system for potions or the crafting systems for spells in order to mitigate the downsides of Atronach, I don't recommend playing this star sign because it will make the game less fun. Just take Mage instead and cast your spells happily and more frequently. But I can't deny that the Atronach is incredibly powerful. I'm going to put it in A tier because you do need very, very specific tools in order to mitigate the downsides. But obviously, a properly managed Atronach build is the strongest in the game because complete immunity to spells and a massive magicka pool are incredibly powerful tools. Obviously, just like the other magicka increases, this one gives you more over the maximum for having high intelligence. So this has the potential to be the best build in the game, but the downside is real, and the amount of kind of tedium that you have to go through in order to manage it is definitely a real problem for the star sign as well. So give it a try. I recommend trying it and seeing if you enjoy this playstyle, but definitely go in with your eyes open that you are changing the game significantly by picking this. Next up, the Tower. So just like the Ritual, the Tower gives us 2 activated abilities, although unlike the Ritual, these are both greater abilities and can only be used once per day, so if you use your Tower power, you have to wait 24 hours, which leaves me feeling a little bit sour. But maybe these abilities are good enough that only once per day is still worth taking a star sign in order to use them. The Tower gives us 2 abilities. The first is a 40-point open lock spell, usable once per day. That opens up to average locks. So relatively difficult, but not very difficult chests you can open with the open lock spell. This is not a significant boost unless you really hate the lockpicking minigame. Even without any investment in security, you should be able to open average chests while only breaking a few lockpicks if you get even reasonable at the lockpicking minigame. It's like just a pretty easy minigame overall, although if you are having more difficulty with it, then the open lock spell may be of more value to you. But if you do want that, then getting it from Alteration is just a totally reasonable option, and then you can just cast it all the time instead of only once per day. And of course, investing in security to make it easier is also a totally reasonable thing to do. And while I don't usually recommend that characters take security as a major skill, it does, the option to do that does mean that the Tower's ability to open locks once per day is just not that exciting. The second one is a little more interesting. It gives you the ability to cast Reflect Damage for 5% for 2 minutes once per day. Now, this reflect damage decreases incoming damage by that amount, and then enemies take that much damage. And importantly, it's not the amount of damage that they take isn't reduced by the difficulty level damage multipliers. So it ends up being a little more damage than it seems like it's going to be when you're playing on high difficulty settings. But obviously, reducing incoming damage by 5% is nothing. You're still going to die in 2 hits anyways on high difficulty levels, and 5% of enemy damage dealt back to them is not going to kill them any faster. So the reflect damage, the Warden spell, is pretty much useless in terms of the effect that it has on actual combat. And that means that the tower has 2 abilities that are basically not valuable. However, there is one corner case that makes the tower very slightly more worth considering. And that's that reflect damage is obviously a very powerful spell if you can get it to higher than 5% values. And outside of the Shivering Isles expansion, there's no way to get this as a spell known so that you can craft custom spells using reflect damage. The Shivering Isles expansion is included in the remaster, so you will have access to it. But if you don't want to play the Shivering Isles first, then you wouldn't have access to the spell, except if you're playing the tower in order to craft with it. Crafted spells of reflect damage are really strong and can impact combat. So there is a way that the tower can be useful if you very, very specifically want to cast reflect damage spells without playing Shivering Isles in order to get that spell effect known. I don't know if this is enough to put it in C tier, honestly, because the actual casts of the spells are kind of useless, but I think the combination of letting players who really hate the lockpicking minigame avoid it, and the extreme corner case for crafting, reflect damage is enough to put it in C tier, but this is a very low C tier, honestly. The tower is very, very situational and mostly a quality of life thing if you really hate lockpicking. The Lord. So the Lord birth sign was completely reworked from original Oblivion in the remaster, and now does something completely different. It used to give you a healing spell and make you weak to fire, but now instead of that, in the remaster, it gives you 15 armor rating, and this stacks with any armor that you have as armor worn, or just gives you 15 base armor if you have no armor at all, and 15 magic resist. These benefits sound pretty strong, and not only are they strong, they're even better than they sound. This is a ridiculous bonus to get from your birth sign. 15 armor in the early game can up to triple your armor that you might have from gear, making you extremely more resilient to incoming damage. And 15 magic resist, even if you don't stack it with other magic resist, is still a really nice benefit. This just reduces incoming magic damage by 15%, which is very, very powerful. The amount of damage mitigation that this provides is absurd, but it gets even better if you are stacking it with other sources of increased magic resist. An orc or a Breton playing a Lord character leaves the sewers with 65% resistance to magic, meaning that getting to 100% is fairly trivial, and also just makes them able to more or less ignore enemy spellcasters with the magic resist from the Lord. This also mitigates the downside of playing an Altmer, who have weakness to elemental damage, so the 15% magic resist offsets that. The Lord's passive benefits are just absurd. The main thing that you're worried about playing on high difficulties is just getting one shot, and this more or less single-handedly prevents that from happening, unlike the other bonuses to your defensive abilities, like the Lady or the Warrior, which increase your health. This is still incredibly strong in the end game, and in some ways even stronger, because you can just get to 100% magic resist, which matters way more in the late game. I can't overstate how good the Lord is. It's, I think, by far the most powerful birth sign in general, of all of them now, though the Mage also does compete with it a little bit, and it's going to go straight into S tier. If there's any doubt in your mind as to what star sign to pick, just pick the Lord. It will be great for any character, no matter what you're doing. It will always be an extremely relevant and excellent bonus. Makes your character vastly more survivable throughout the entire game. And we're back to another nice simple one, the Lady. The Lady gives you 10 points of endurance and 10 points of willpower, so it's basically the same as the Warrior, but you get willpower instead of strength. The question with the lady, of course, is 10 points of willpower better than 10 points of strength? And the answer is basically yes. Willpower is a more powerful attribute than strength, especially in the early game, because regenerating your magicka is very important for every character, and increasing your fatigue is very important for every character. Whereas even for characters doing damage based on strength, with strength-based weaponry, the multiplier doesn't get relevant until you have higher level equipment. So willpower giving you more dodges, blocks, sprints, and power attacks will increase your combat effectiveness more than the 10 points of strength will in the early game. So for a martial character, it's better, and obviously for a character casting a lot of magic, it's better because willpower increases your magicka regeneration, and it stacks with itself. This is another star sign that got a lot worse when in the remaster, because early endurance used to be important, but now you can take endurance later on and still get the full value of the HP per level up. But the lady is still a totally reasonable pick. Pretty much any character that wants the warrior should just take the lady instead, though any character that wants the lady should probably just take the lord, mage, or thief instead. But I'm going to give it B tier because this is a relevant boost to your survivability and combat effectiveness in the early game, even if it will fall off pretty quickly in the later game. Next up, the lover. So the lover star sign is, well, it's literally a joke. The question is that joke powerful enough in-game to be worth taking anyways, or is this one just in there for the goofs? The joke, of course, is that how it works is you paralyze an enemy for 10 points, but you really tire yourself out in the process, damaging your fatigue for 120 points, hence, the lover. This is a greater power, so it's useful only once per day, and 10 seconds of paralysis is a pretty reasonable amount, and reducing your fatigue is not anywhere near as bad in the remaster because it no longer impacts your weapon damage as it is in original Oblivion, but once per day for a paralysis power that will let you hit an enemy just a few times and also seriously crimps your ability to continue to act in combat afterwards is just not worth it. 10 seconds in the early game is not long enough to kill enemies, and in the later game, this effect is just not going to work out very well anyways, and you have more powerful things to do regardless. So the Lover's Kiss power is just never going to win you fights that you weren't going to win otherwise, because it's got real downsides and the upsides aren't that strong. A lot of enemies also have inherent resist paralysis, so they will get back up sooner than the 10 seconds, or they'll get unparalyzed sooner than the 10 seconds that's listed on the Lover's sheet. So this ability just doesn't do much and doesn't really work. It's a once per day ability with very little effect, so of course we're going to put it in D tier. And finally, the Serpent. The Serpent is another greater power birth sign with an ability that can be cast once per day, only in this case the ability does 4 different things all at once. Firstly, it does damage health, so it creates a damage health effect on an enemy for 20 seconds for 3 points a second, so 60 total damage. This is enough to kill some enemies, but very slowly, of course, and against more difficult enemies will not kill them, so is not going to be something that just wins combat on its own. You'll have to combine it with doing other damage in order to effectively kill enemies with the Serpent ability. It also damages your own fatigue, just like the Lover, which, again, is not as bad in the remaster, but still reduces your combat effectiveness pretty significantly, but also has 2 positive effects on yourself, curing poison and doing a dispel. Curing poison is pretty useful, and once per day is about right, but you can also just carry potions of cure poison. They're very easy to come by, and so you usually will not want to take a birth sign rather than just carrying a potion. Even if you aren't an alchemist, you can buy them or find them in the world, so a cure poison ability is not that exciting. Dispel's a little more interesting. How Dispel works is it removes magic-created effects on you. What's dispellable is a little bit unclear in the game sometimes, but a lot of effects that are on you that were caused by magic can be removed by Dispel. And the Serpent ability is slightly better than a standard Dispel because it's a greater power rather than a spell. That means, because it's a power and not a spell, it can be cast while silenced to dispel the silence effect on you and allow you to cast spells. So if you're playing a character that's mostly a spellcaster and would be devastated by being silenced, the Serpent does let you break out of that. Is that corner case worth taking a birth sign that just gives you one ability per day with relatively minor effects? No, definitely not. There is that very, very minor corner case, but that's like a tiny, tiny fraction of fights in the game and only for very specific characters. And even is still worse than just taking the Lord and getting magic resist to prevent that from happening in the first place. So yeah, the Serpent just doesn't do anything. Similar to the Shadow or the Lover, this is a once per day ability with very low impact and is also going straight into D tier. So, to sum it all up, what you can see with the birth signs is that the variance in power level between the ones that do pretty much nothing and the ones that give you massive bonuses to your character throughout the entire game is quite wide. So choosing the correct birth sign can make a huge difference in how powerful your character is. When in doubt, always just pick the Lord. It will always be a relevant bonus and will work for any character. It's a huge benefit, especially if you combine it with other effects that increase your magic resist, but just makes all your character, no matter what, way tankier. Mage and Thief are also great default options for most spellcasters. Mage is going to be the go-to. And then Apprentice and Atronach have very specific playstyles associated with them. These are extremely powerful options, but definitely more if you are a more experienced or expert player and want a specific way of playing the game, or to reach really, really high end game power level, but maybe have a slightly more difficult early game. The Lady can be pretty useful just as a nice default option, although usually the Lord or Thief is going to be better. And the Ritual will be a nice situational pick. Everything in C or D tier you can usually steer clear of, though you won't have vastly hurt your character by taking the Warrior or Steed. Alright, my friends, I hope that you enjoyed this look at the birth signs in The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion Remastered. As of course, always, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit the like button. Helps me out with the algorithm, so I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Oblivion and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.